So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last CPC Interdisciplinary Research Seminar for the fall 2020 semester. My name is Carolyn Halpern. I'm a CPC faculty fellow and chair of the Department of Maternal and Child Health. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Margaret Hicken. I'm proud to say that Dr. Hicken received her MPH from our MCH department here at UNC. And she earned her PhD in health behavior, health education at the University of Michigan in 2010. She was also an NIA predoctoral fellow at the Population Studies Center at the University of Michigan during her doctoral training. She was also later a Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholar and completed a postdoc in the Department of Epidemiology at the University of Michigan. Currently, Dr. Hicken is a research assistant professor at the Survey Research Center at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. And there she's the director of the program in Transdisciplinary Approaches to Racism and Health Inequalities. She's also a faculty associate at the Population Studies Center and a research investigator in the Department of Internal Medicine, both at the University of Michigan. She is the author or co-author of more than 40 publications. She has a K01 from the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases, and she's the PI of an R01 from the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. That project is titled Racial Inequities, Racial Inequalities in Health Throughout Adulthood, the Cumulative Impact of Neighborhood Chemical and Non-Chemical Stressors on Epigenomic Pathways. She has mentored many undergraduate and master's and doctoral students, and she's very active in service related to university diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today she will speak on landscapes of racial dispossession and control, cultural and structural racism, and population health inequities. If you have questions for Dr. Hicken, please put them in the chat. If it's a clarification question, then I'll interrupt for that. Otherwise, we'll hold the questions and we'll go through them as part of the discussion after the presentation. So welcome, Dr. Hicken. We're very much looking forward to hearing about your work.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me and allowing me to share some of my research. I still consider, since North Carolina was really my first introduction into graduate school, I still think of Carolina as, an intellectual home for me, and I miss it a lot. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the research that I've been embarking on the past few years. I did want to make one small correction just to kind of celebrate myself, is that I was awarded tenure and promotion this year. So now I am research associate professor at the Institute for Social Research. And so the landscapes, what I'm going to be talking about today is this landscapes project. It's an interdisciplinary, theory-driven data and empirical research project that links historical and contemporary forms of structural racism to health inequities. And in this talk, I'll spend most of my time discussing the theoretical foundation of this work. So I spent a lot of time during my doctoral and postdoctoral and early faculty career developing an empirical foundation for this idea that racial health inequities ultimately stem from differential unequal exposures to social and environmental toxicants. And what I've done over the past couple of years is I've really spent a lot of time delving into many other disciplines and their work to develop a theoretical approach, a conceptual approach to guide the rest of my empirical research. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the theories that I've borrowed and the ways in which I've integrated them, in case that might be of interest to those of you doing work on racial health inequities, to develop, to kind of develop your own theories as well. And then I'll spend the last few moments together before the Q&A on some very, very early empirical results that stem from the R01 that I have, that Carolyn mentioned. So And again, the reason why I want to spend so much time talking about theory and only spend a little bit of time at the end showing some empirical results is because I'm hoping that it will clarify some of the challenges that we have doing empirical work on health inequities. So the racial inequities in health have been so thoroughly documented, especially with regard to Black-white inequities in health, that I'm not even going to describe any. We know what they are. In fact, I might argue that we're done with the description phase of health inequities, Black-white health inequities in population research. We really don't need any more. Now we are moving to the phase of really trying to understand what is driving them so that we can build an empirical foundation for change. I could discuss the literature on exposures in any American institution, as these inequities are universal in the labor market, in our educational system, in the criminal justice and surveillance systems and media, but I have been studying environmental exposures, and this is what I'd like to share today. So Black neighborhoods have and continue to bear the brunt of hazardous waste siting in the US. Environmental scientists have been documenting racial inequities in these exposures for about 30, 40 years now, showing that hazardous waste landfills are disproportionately sited in Black and now Hispanic communities, and that hazardous waste land throughout the Black Belt especially, which is the part of the southern United States where there are high proportions of Black residents. So Black neighborhoods for many years were becoming these dumping grounds for waste, and it had been explicitly linked to an environmental racism, so that these inequities were definitely based on racial composition of the neighborhood. Critical geographer Laura Pulido argues that when and so I'm going to be dropping a few names, and then I can also then talk about, because I draw from different literatures, and I can talk more about the work that these other people have produced. And I also, if you're interested in this area of environmental justice, I highly recommend some of their work, but I can talk about their work more broadly. But so critical geographer Laura Pulido argues that when talking about the environment, we often talk about sinks, where places, these are places where we dump and dispose of our waste. But I would argue that people have actually become these sinks. The people who we consider disposable become the site of our disposable waste. And Black neighborhoods are disproportionately the site of these environmental sinks. But the residents are literally the sinks, absorbing society's waste into their bodies. And that is often what environmental justice or environmental health work does, including some of the work that's being done there at Carolina, with regard to measuring, the exposures within the body that have been absorbed into the body. So research indicates, for example, racial inequities in exposure to nearly every researched environmental hazard. Black families are more likely to live in fence line zones. These are dangerous zones close to chemical facilities compared to other families. Black neighborhoods are also more likely to have greater road and traffic density compared to other neighborhoods. And we're all likely familiar with the Flint water crisis, which was here in Michigan. It took years to finally bring action to bring the lead levels down. But many in Flint are still, to this day, actually advised not to drink water from the tap. However, the lead levels in Flint's water are now better than, say, Benton Harbor, which is 92% Black, or Highland Park in Detroit, which is 90% Black, but you don't hear of these things in the media. Indeed, in the US, potable water is typically assumed to be universal, but in fact, it is actually incomplete and it's racially patterned. The Black Belt along the South is a plumbing poverty hotspot, where Black households are more likely than others to have inadequate plumbing and be excluded from municipal water and actually waste services as well. And there's some great new research done by a critical geographer there. I think she's at Duke, Daniel Purifoy, looking at unincorporated towns that were historically Black towns in the South and how they have and then unincorporated white towns and the differences that they have in access to municipal waste and water services. So inequities, and since I'm talking to an audience in North Carolina, this will likely be something that you're familiar with. So there are inequities also reported for concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, in farming communities. And while human waste, and so a lot of this research actually came out of the School of Public Health there, the environmental health department there, and Steve Wing's work decades ago. So while human waste is treated and taken through mechanical filtration before being released into the environment, animal waste from CAFOs are channeled into lagoons. And one of these pictures is actually a picture of one of the lagoons. I'm not sure if it's in North Carolina. And stored untreated before it's utilized for farming. And Carolyn was just saying that you had some rainfall from Eta, and a lot of times there's been a lot of research on how these lagoons then, due to the rainfall, are then flooded and seep over into outside the lagoons. And actually that picture is of a flooded lagoon. So such lagoons are not contained. They eventually leach and can overflow with heavy rain, spilling raw waste and sewage onto the waterways and landscapes. And CAFOs have been linked to numerous health outcomes in the surrounding communities, ranging from respiratory ailments, including asthma, mucosal irritation, infectious diseases, including tuberculosis and septicemia, and chronic conditions, including anemia, high blood pressure, and kidney disease. And so CAFOs are more likely to be sited near Black communities and schools where higher proportions of Black and Latinx students and lower proportions of white students attend. So these inequities in environmental exposures have been so designed and planned through collusion between the state and industry that these environmental inequities, the geographer Laura Polito has reframed environmental racism and called that state-sanctioned slow violence. And I'll discuss how this environmental racism, or this what she calls state-sanctioned slow violence, has become the contemporary sociopolitically acceptable form of racial violence that stems for centuries. So the foundations of the landscape research is that our contemporary inequities, racial inequities in health, are not an aberration of an otherwise equitable and meritocratic system. These inequities are natural outcomes of our American brand of cultural and structural racism. And so during the first bulk of my talk, I'm going to outline some of the features of cultural and structural racism, what I mean when I say that, and the relationship to each other, and then the relationship to environmental racism and health inequities. And I'll be drawing heavily from the introduction to a special issue that I co-edited in a recent Social Science and Medicine publication. So if you want more reading, this introduction to the special issue on structural racism and health actually has a lot of citations, a lot of interdisciplinary citations if you wanted recommendations for future reading. So, and I've continued to hone these ideas, and I'm weaving in more humanities with the anthropology and sociology that I've been working with. And we'll share these, and I'm going to share these new ideas with you. And they're also in a paper manuscript that I have. The revision is under review right now. So we'll see what you think, and I'd be interested in hearing your feedback on these ideas. So because there are many lay and academic definitions of racism, I first just want to start off with what I mean when I say racism. And I draw from both philosopher Charles Mills and psychologist Shelley Harrell to construct this working definition of racism. So Mills, a philosopher, begins, racism is a political system, a particular power structure of formal and informal rule, socioeconomic privilege, and norms for the differential distribution of material wealth and opportunities, benefits and burdens, rights and duties. And that is from the social contract, the racial contract, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And then Harrell continues, where members of the dominant group create or accept their societal privilege by maintaining structures, ideologies, values, and behavioral norms that have the intent or effect of leaving non-dominant group members relatively excluded from power, esteem, status, and or equal status or access to societal resources. So the thing that I want to highlight here is that when I talk about racism, I am talking about a system. I'm not talking about intent, or I'm not talking about individual dislike of a group. I'm not talking about prejudice and discrimination. I am talking about a self-perpetuating system that has existed here for centuries. So as you're likely all demographers and epidemiologists in the audience, one thing that I like is philosopher Achille Mbembe's definition of racism that he draws from his work on necropolitics. I highly recommend reading his work as well. He says racism is above all a technology aimed at permitting the exercise of biopower, the tool that allows us as a society to regulate the distribution of death. And so Mbembe himself does not actually study health in particular, but as a philosopher understands that death is the ultimate endpoint. So racism dictates who is allowed to live, and he extends this notion of death beyond simply the dichotomy of life and death, but rather he discusses the living dead, those who live in a state of injury or phantom state, perhaps what humanist and cultural geographer Catherine McKittrick calls this slow death. That we might call chronic disease, morbidity. So cultural racism. So cultural racism is the shared understanding of who is worthy of full symbolic or legal citizenship based on racialized group membership. So cultural racism encompasses the socially accepted ideologies, values, and behavioral norms that Harrell was talking about, ultimately set by the dominant power group. And in the United States, that is white Americans. So cultural racism is a particularly insidious form of racism because it operates at the level of our shared social subconscious. The processes that comprise cultural racism are invisible to many because they are our givens, our assumptions, our defaults, and to borrow from Joe Fagan, our racial frame. We have this white racial frame in the United States. But the result is this reified set of ideologies, values, and behavioral norms that were set centuries ago. So ultimately, cultural racism shapes the answer to the questions, whose life counts and who deserves to live a full and healthy life. So philosopher Charles Mills called this concept the racial contract, and he has a book called The Racial Contract. He also has several readings. I highly recommend this book. It's a set of formal and informal agreements operating in the background in which classes of humans and not quite humans are created based on racial category. So cultural racism dictates who is disposable, who will serve as those environmental sinks that Laura Pulido talked about. Indeed, humanist Henry Giraud says that the category of waste no longer simply includes material goods, but also human beings. Through larger societal discourses around personal character, personal responsibility, and cultural homogeneity, entire populations are considered disposable and expelled from full social and economic benefits of society. So structural racism then is, I would consider this to be the actualization of cultural racism. So structural racism is cultural racism in action. Our social structure is composed of the formal and informal institutions of our society. And when I say that, I mean like our institutions like our media, our healthcare systems, our educational system, our criminal justice and surveillance systems, are the systems that oversee our environmental stewardship. So, and these institutions are actually symbiotic, even though, and they're interrelated. So it may seem that our criminal justice system is operating in a silo to itself, and our education system is operating in a silo unto itself, because we have these different departments, our different institutions that oversee, you know, as part of the state that oversee these different institutions. However, social scientists have shown that actually these institutions are symbiotic and can operate together. Like the symbiotic sea anemone and the clownfish that are affected by each other, I would argue that changes in one institution can actually be felt by other institutions. And importantly, when we attempt to intervene in one institution, other institutions will move in to restore the equilibrium ultimately set up by cultural racism toward white privilege. So, and I have some examples of that. So consider the criminal justice system. It may seem like it operates in a silo. However, in his book, Deadly Symbiosis, he also has an article, an extensive article in case you don't want to buy the entire book. Sociologist Loic Wacant argues that in order to understand mass imprisonment, we must pay attention to the symbiotic relationship that the criminal justice system has with segregated, under-resourced, over-polluted neighborhoods. And both are products of the history of racial violence and control, and they're inextricably tied and linked to one another to maintain this racial control and marginality. Cities and private businesses and industries collude to invest in certain neighborhoods and systematically disinvest in other neighborhoods. This leaves, he argues that this leaves Black families trapped in neighborhoods that are poorly invested, that are poorly resourced and overpolluted. And Wacant describes these neighborhoods as a sort of prison in and of themselves, that social mobility is quite challenging. And we know from Raj Chetty and from work here done at the University of Michigan, from Fabian Pfeffer, that wealth mobility is actually, particularly for Black Americans, for Black families, they're much more likely to experience a downward mobility. And Wacant talks about, these neighborhoods kind of being a trap and a prison in and of themselves. David Pellow, who is an environmental justice scholar, then talks about also the symbiosis, more specifically between the prison system and our environmental justice, or the system that oversees our environmental stewardship. He focuses on the hazardous working condition of prisons in the major prison industrial complexes. For example, prisoners have been contracted to prepare electronic waste that includes broken glass and toxic metals for recycling. Prisoners are not protected by regulations that protect non-prison workplaces. So you can kind of see how there's also then this symbiosis between the institutions that oversee our workplace and labor market. While regulations around the working conditions of prisoners have been developed, studies show, including his work, show that they are actually poorly enforced. So another feature of cultural racism acts as a distortion lens that renders racialized and racially hierarchical institutions neutral and rational. So I put this picture upside down because through the lens, it looks like the tree is right side up, but in reality, in our science fiction reality, the tree is actually upside down. So Mills, I'm drawing from Mills again, and his treatise on the racial contract. So the racial contract, he prescribes for its signatories an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, and I'm going to explain what that means. So it's a particular pattern of of cognitive dysfunction that produces this ironic outcome that white Americans will not understand the world that has been created by white Americans, by whiteness. So what he means by that is that not only do we have this cultural racism operating in the background, that we have already decided who is worthy of their life, who is worthy of living a full and healthy life, who is worthy of their full participation, full benefit of their citizenship as Americans. We've already made that is operating in the background. We develop policies and institutions based on that. But he further says that not only have we all agreed to this, but it comes with this that there is this intentional cognitive dissonance, where we refuse to believe that. We refuse to believe that the United States is not a meritocratic society, that we are not, that it is not possible to believe that if you work hard, you will not get ahead. And the self-delusion, he says, is not accidental, but it is actually part of that racial contract, part of cultural racism. And so what that does, that we are not allowed to speak about race and racism, is that we are left with then talking about more neutral and rational ideas that result then in, that seem to accidentally result in these racial inequities. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So that stem from environmental racism. So the racial composition of a neighborhood has been and continues to be by far the primary predictor of siting of industrial polluters. And so neighborhoods with mostly Black families are more likely, and also in certain parts of the country, in certain cities, also neighborhoods with mostly Hispanic families are more likely than any other type of neighborhood to have a polluter, an industrial polluter nearby. So cultural racism dictates that the lives of white families matter more than others, although we don't say that. This is an unspoken agreement operating in the background, so that those who oversee our environmental stewardship, those who oversee the permitting policies of where polluters are allowed to dump, or are allowed to be situated and allowed to dump, we don't talk about race necessarily. We talk about how it will negatively impact property values. Or we talk about how citing a polluter in this place where they have to dump, or putting fracking in this place, will be met with too much resistance. So, and perhaps this last argument is probably even trickier, that the polluting companies will offer needed jobs to economically distressed communities. So we need to place these polluters in certain neighborhoods and away from other neighborhoods. And so we can do this by talking about an economic rationality, or that it's race neutral, because we use this other language. However, if we dig deeper and we understand that operating in the background is always the idea that some families are more worthy of their health than other families, then we can begin to see that we can begin to clear up this distorted lens. So recent research shows that by Michael Ash and colleagues, it was a really elegant study showing that actually in the United States, across the United States, that residents of these neighborhoods, of the polluted neighborhoods, don't actually get the jobs. The jobs, particularly the managerial jobs at the polluting companies, go to people from other neighborhoods, particularly other white neighborhoods. So the neighborhoods of primarily Black families, they bear the brunt of both the pollution, the toxic pollution, and no economic benefit. Nevertheless, as I said, without understanding cultural racism and what's operating in the background, we might buy into these seemingly rational ideas that we need to place polluters in certain neighborhoods and away from others. And so let's see. So structural racism also includes the erasure of historical processes that might clarify the link between racialized groups and health. So structural racism as the actualization. These are the institutions that comprise our society and the way that they operate. However, one thing that structural racism also includes is that we forget how the institutions that we have today are actually linked to history, how they came to be. So when we examine only contemporary exposures, it's tempting to think that there's a reasonable explanation for the ways in which the social exposures are racially unequal. However, historians and historical sociologists, social scientists have documented that we have throughout history maintained institutions explicitly designed for white privilege. And so while throughout history they were more explicit in their racial language, we have the same institutions operating today. It's just that it may or may not have that same racial language. So we have had these institutions, these practices that are meant to keep racialized non-white Americans separated from other Americans and relegated to the worst social and economic circumstances. Even if many of these policies and practices, including Jim Crow laws or black codes or the mortgage lending practices that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit, are technically illegal, they so entrenched residential, educational, occupational segregation, and the unequal wealth distribution that we can actually see its impact today, which is why we need to keep history in mind. The other reason why we need to keep history in mind is because neighborhoods, our landscape is dynamic. And so we might take a contemporary exposure and link it to health, and we might come up with a paradoxical outcome that, maybe that segregation is not current segregation is not related to certain health outcomes or certain environmental exposures. However, what we have to do is we have to understand the history of place and understand how place changes over time, to then understand that always operating in the background is this movement toward an equilibrium back toward white privilege. And so that we have to account for that dynamic nature of place. In the interest of time, I'm gonna skip through a few things and just keep going. So the final thing, the final aspect of cultural and structural racism that I want to discuss is its shape-shifting capability. So institutions that comprise our social structure, so this is media, our educational system, our healthcare system, all of these institutions adapt to contemporaneous socio-political norms. So what that means, so institutional practices and even entire institutions, like for example, chattel slavery, may fall out of socio-political favor. However, the institutions adapt and conform to what is politically acceptable. So well-known examples of this, this adaptation are outlined in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which is actually quite old now. I think maybe 10 years old or more. But I also highly recommend that book, or Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book, Golden Gulag, which I also highly recommend, about the prison system. So without changing the underlying cultural racism of who fully counts as human or American, any shifts in an institution to fit what is currently politically acceptable by the public will be replaced by other formal and informal institutions in what Achille Mbembe, the philosopher who I mentioned before, calls a more civilized way of killing. So he says that we continually reinvent so that we always have this more civilized way of killing people. And the reason why I put this here, this image here is, so Henry Giraud, humanist, compares Emmett Till's gruesome murder in 1955 Mississippi to the response to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. So he considered the racial state at the time of Katrina, the Katrina response, just a different modality of state terrorism marked by a less overt form of white racism. However, the reason why I bring this up is because since that time, since he wrote this, comparing Emmett Till's murder and dumping in the Tallahatchie River to Hurricane Katrina, since that time, we have had another shift in our socio-political norms, especially in the past 4 or more years. And what I wanted to show you here is that in the past several years, the signage marking where Till went into the river had been a site for white supremacists to shoot it up and then to pose with it proudly in recent years, so that they actually had to replace that signage with bulletproof signage. So you can kind of see that always our norms are shifting, or what is acceptable is shifting. And so this affects our institutions and the way they operate, including our informal institutions and the way they operate. And so we need to kind of consider that when examining which exposures we're going to model. I will give one more example. So Catherine McKittrick talks about spatialized violence, the spatialized violence of the plantation, and how it profited from destroying a Black sense of place, how there was this force. I don't think she uses the word forced migration, but others talk about this idea of forced migration. And since I'm speaking to a Carolina audience, I wanted to talk about, I just wanted to mention that Jim Thomas, who is there, was one of the first scholars long ago, this is long ago, when he was doing work in the US, talked about the incarceration and imprisonment as forced migration. And then he talked about the destabilization of this forced migration of people who were imprisoned out of their communities into the prison system. And since then, there have been other sociologists and economists who have studied the ways in which mass incarceration, pulling people out of their communities, actually destabilizes the communities from which they came, and in what economists might call negative externalities. Sociologists have called these spillover effects. So what does this mean for our research? And I am hoping that I can just get to the very bits of from very, very early empirical results. So what does this mean for our research? So one thing is that I would argue that, and I'm happy to discuss, is that there are no paradoxes, that, you know, we talk about the Latino paradox, or we talk about these other paradoxes, like how could it be that this is not related, or there is not a racial pattern here. But I think that what this means is that we need to just dig a little bit deeper to understand what is operating in the background. So another is that interdisciplinary approaches build a stronger empirical literature. It is really, I believe that only when I really started to integrate history and geography into my work in sociology and anthropology, and biomedicine, that I really began to understand what is operating in the background. And then, of course, both qualitative and quantitative approaches are required. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, that now, if we're considering, when we talk about racial health inequalities, and we're considering then what is structure, what is racism, and how is racism embodied, that we may need to move to outcomes that mark more, that are more exposure friendly. So they might mark the health of multiple systems, rather than only focusing on hypertension, or only focusing on very specific health outcomes. It's just an idea. So, and then we might also then need to consider what our measures mean across time and place. I know that a lot of literature on racism has focused on interpersonal discrimination, individual level discrimination. However, that literature is, especially with regard to physical health, is met with challenges. And I would argue that it is because when somebody reports discrimination in these surveys, that we have to understand where are they in place and where are they in time, because discrimination will mean different things. I think that David Williams, he presented at a conference that I was at years ago, and this was at the very beginning of, we started to see the more overt white supremacy starting to come to the forefront again, and he showed that white Americans were starting to report discrimination more often than Black Americans. And so, and that might be considered a paradox unless you consider the time and the place and what is, what is going on, and what is operating in the background. And then it actually is not a paradox. And so we need to examine seemingly neutral institutions, policies, and practices, and always question who is ultimately controlled by these policies. And then, as I was saying before, when considering contemporary exposures, always consider history and how these exposures came to be, because place is dynamic. So in these last few minutes, I want to discuss very quickly just some very, very early, I'm talking early, like some of these results are very descriptive just from 2 days ago, and some of them are from late last week. But I just wanted to give you a hint of what we're starting to see with this project. So, so returning to this, so let's see. Okay, oops. Okay, so we'll just start here. So this stems back from my dissertation work. So I was struck by an article on the hypertensive impact of environmental lead. So even after decades after lead was removed from the marketplace, there was no more lead in gasoline or in paint, lead levels had dropped. So you can see from 1976 even to 1988 that for both Black and white adults, lead levels in the blood had dropped dramatically. So these policies worked. And you can see that blood levels for both Black and white adults is relatively low. And similar, they're different, statistically different, but they're both very low. However, one thing that continued to happen is that Black but not white adults continued to show a very robust, well-documented association between lead and blood pressure. So to say that another way, so Black adults then continued, even in 1988, even in when I was doing my dissertation, that those data come from 2008, I think, in Haynes. Even then, Black but not white Americans were showing the association between lead and blood pressure. And most toxicologists argued that it is because Black Americans are biologically more susceptible to the health impact of lead. However, I posited something different. I thought that there was something fundamentally socially different about Black and white adults. So lead is known to activate the biological stress response system, and so is social stress. And I thought that they might actually be acting synergistically to result in this pattern. And so I published, this is two of the 3 papers, my dissertation papers, showing that in fact, only Black Americans who report high levels of stress or socioeconomic disadvantage, those are the Black Americans and not others that are showing this association. And it was one of the first of its kind to kind of posit this idea that institutions may be working together, or that that different exposures may be working together to result in health inequities. So then I moved to air pollution during my postdoc, and then I took a little break from environmental health to work on theory development, but then also work on these ideas of vigilance, which I can talk about another time. But now in the past few years, I've returned to this idea of what NIH calls chemical and non-chemical stressors. So stressors on the body, biological stressors on the body, chemical meaning they're coming from toxicants, and non-chemical meaning they're coming from more social exposures. So in my current R01, I am testing the idea that, that air pollution, that contemporary and historical social context interacts with contemporary air pollution exposures to result in these different DNA methylation patterns. And and so let me, so part of this study includes data collection. I collected the 6th wave of the Americans Changing Lives study, which is a study that was started by Jim House and colleagues in 1986. And now 2019 was our 33-year follow-up, and included a blood collection in their home. And then we link that to 33 years chemical and non-chemical stressor data. So right now, what we are waiting for, we finished the survey data collection and the methylation, and they're both in the lab. Actually, our survey data are being cleaned and are almost done. And then the methylation data are in the lab and are currently being quantified. So I don't have data yet. However, we have started on other facets of these questions to kind of give you a hint of what's going on. So the first paper, my colleagues and I are examining whether there's a link between these mortgage lending policies of the 1930s to contemporary industrial pollution concentration. So as part of the New Deal policies in the 1930s, the federal government wanted to be able to provide working class and middle class families with the ability to own and invest in their own homes, eventually own their own homes. Before that, we had a very different mortgage process where only the very wealthy could eventually own their own homes. And part of that was that the federal government would insure certain loans, certain mortgages, but not others. And so they contracted with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, or I'm going to call them HOLC, to assess neighborhood risk. And it was based on a number of things, but largely based on demographic characteristics of that neighborhood. And they would rate these neighborhoods as desirable or hazardous and undesirable. And they gave it a color-coded system, an ABCD color-coded system, and D, which is the most hazardous, which is where Black residents, a lot of immigrant residents lived, those were coded D or red, and that's where the term redlining comes from. And it was very difficult to get, almost impossible to get a low interest mortgage rate, but also very difficult to get a mortgage if you lived in one of these neighborhoods. So, and Richard Rothstein has written a lot about this, and I highly recommend, this is another book I highly recommend if you're interested in the history of redlining and what that means today. So this is a paper that just came out, not my paper, but a paper that just came out looking at HOLC. So some people have started already investigating. Nancy Krieger has looked at this. There was a paper linking HOLC neighborhoods in Philadelphia and current neighborhood violence. But this is, since this is kind of pollution related, I thought that I'd present this. In California, Nardone and colleagues looked at historical HOLC assessment, ABCD, and the color-coded and current asthma emergency department visits. And what they found is that there is an association between, even with dynamic neighborhood turnover and gentrification, that neighborhoods that were coded red or coded yellow, which also means that they were declining, are more likely to have higher current asthma emergency department visits. And this is for San Francisco and Oakland, San Diego, and then Los Angeles. So they are looking at asthma emergency department visits, but not air pollution. And I wanted to just kind of show you what our air pollution data looks like. So, and yeah, so Carolyn, do you think that I should stop soon? I'm looking at the time and I haven't even gotten to the methylation data, but if there are a lot of pressing questions, I don't want to cut people off, but I can definitely continue or I can cut.
Right now, there are 3 questions in the chat. One I think is very quick. The other 2 may take a little more time. So, and I know people probably are very happy to engage in a conversation. So if you want to save some time for that, that would be great.
Okay, then let me do this. Let me just say, rather than describing the data, which I can do if you have questions on that, I will just say that in our very early descriptive analyses that just came this week or last week, that what we are finding is that across the country, that indeed what we do find is that while, and this graph kind of shows it very descriptively, we have the years of industrial pollution data when industrial pollution data was starting in toxic concentration from 1990 forward to 2018. And this y-axis is simply the concentration. It's a modeled concentration. That we see that those neighborhoods across the country that we've flipped the color coding so that places that were labeled D or hazardous here in this graph is actually blue. So sorry for that confusion. But that even in the 1930s across the nation, if they were coded as hazardous or red, could not get home loans, were systematically disinvested over the coming decades, that even when air pollution or industrial pollution has declined for all neighborhoods across the country, that still those neighborhoods are experiencing higher levels of industrial concentration. So we have many next steps in our modeling to do. One thing then, the one thing is the other paper that we have under that we're working on right now has to do with contemporary segregation, neighborhood segregation, and DNA methylation. And so I don't have time to go into how we measure methylation or how I'm measuring segregation, but let me just give you the end result so methylation, there have been some, so we have biological age, we have our chronological age, which is the age that we celebrate every birthday. But then what some aging researchers have done is to create these biological ages that are based on how much methylation that we see in our genome. And there are about a dozen or more different of these methylation clocks, which, and the argument is that the clocks represent how fast you are aging biologically, despite your chronological age. So what we looked at is we looked at the link between neighborhood segregation and your kind of underlying biological age. And we took one of these clocks, the Levine clock, and I can talk about how the Levine clock is different from these other clocks. And what we did find in our very initial analyses, and this is using MESA, the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, because as you recall, I don't have my methylation data ready yet, it's in the lab, that in fact, that in MESA, residents of Black neighborhood, of increasing, where there is increasingly segregation of Black residents, that they experience this kind of accelerated aging by this methylation clock. And I'm going to stop there. I can tell you about the next steps. I want to definitely give out a shout out to my colleagues and my grant, the grants that have allowed for these projects. I also want to give out 2 shout outs for, because the audience may be interested. We have for Racism Lab, which is a group that I oversee. We have an annual meeting every year, and this year we are partnering with the Interdisciplinary Association for Population Health Science for our February 24th symposium on structural racism and population health inequalities. And the thing is, the reason why I wanted to tell you is that if anybody has any posters that you've presented recently in the past 1 or 2 years and you'd like to bring it to an interdisciplinary audience, we would love to see your posters and include them, even if you've already presented them. And then also, I am a co-chair of the membership committee for IAPHS, which is an interdisciplinary association for population health science. And this year, I'm also co-chairing the 2021 annual conference on racism, power, and social justice. I would strongly recommend becoming a member of this organization if you're interested in interdisciplinary population health research. Okay, so now I'm done. I'm done with all the plugs.
Thanks so much, Maggie, for that wonderful presentation, and apologies for not being aware of your recent promotion. Congratulations.
Oh no, I don't think the website has even changed. I don't think.
So a first quick question is, Brandy Curtis asked on the slide, what is racism? Where does the second quote come from? It's cited as on page 43.
Yeah, okay, so let me see. So that would be, let me go back. I think that's Shelley Harrell, right? It's the psychologist. Let me keep moving back. So I had more slides than I thought I did. I thought I had like, oh, this one, right? This one. Okay, so this one is, so her name is Shelley Harrell, Harrell. And if you look up, so I don't want to look on my computer because I'm sharing my screen, but I'm looking up on my phone because I'm sorry, I took off the citation at the bottom. I must have taken off the footnote to this slide. So I'm looking up right now on my phone, Shelley Harrell, racism, and yes. Okay, so it's the first thing that comes up. So it's a multidimensional conceptualization of racism-related stress. So that's the title. It's Harrell, Harrell from 2000. And if you Google it, it will be the first thing that comes up. And then, of course, Charles Mills, this comes from his book, The Racial Contract.
So thanks. A second question is from Alexis Dennis. She thanks you for an awesome presentation and asks, do you have any recommendations for the types of data that researchers need to collect moving forward to empirically demonstrate the link between structural racism and historical nature of structural racism with the racial health disparities observed today?
That is a great question. Data, the data question, and that's where we always get, where we kind of get stuck. One great thing, though, is that with the growth of administrative data and with the growth of interdisciplinary research, where we can now, where we collaborate with historians, I have been learning that we can actually access a lot of data. So first of all, there is one of my doc students she's in epidemiology at Michigan. She is actually trying to figure out using administrative data, how to create these structural racism measures. And I know that other people are also working on this. So one thing that you could do is this depends on your conceptualization of what structural racism is. Like what institutions are you looking to highlight? So some things, so at the in epidemiology, most basically people look at segregation, neighborhood and city level segregation. I am looking for environmental health. I'm looking at where industrial polluters are cited. Other ways that you could look at it are through our criminal justice system. So you can look at area level incarceration levels, area level inequalities of incarceration, because that gets at the inequity in surveillance. And you can, let me see, there's also other forms of surveillance. There is also policing data in many places. Let me think of there are a few other things that my mind was actually working too quickly. And so now I've forgotten. There is also, with regard to history, so there is the Hulk data that we're now linking to, because of the University of Richmond, they digitized an overwhelming majority of those Hulk maps. Now I'm working with Hetty Lee and David Cunningham. And so David Cunningham and Jeff Ward are two historical sociologists. And then Hetty is a demographer who trained at Carolina. And so she is working at WashU. They are actually now creating data sets from paper archives on historical data, including like monuments and trying to create area level measures of Confederate monuments, of monuments to other white supremacists. There's also links between slavery, so you can get, and Jim Crow laws. So Polly Murray she has a compendium, it's probably the most comprehensive compendium to 1950, and then the historical sociologists that I work with have moved beyond that to the present of to the 1970s of Jim Crow laws around the country. So it just depends on what it is you're trying to measure and how you think structural racism is working, and which institutions you think have an impact. And I haven't even mentioned the educational system. There are people who are looking to understand, Sean Reardon, a sociologist on the West Coast, I can't remember from which institution, is looking at educational segregation, that you can look at, and you can find when you start collaborating with experts in those fields, you can begin to expose, or you can begin to unearth a lot of data that we can then link to through area to people in surveys.
So we're at a little after 1 o'clock. There is one more question, which I think is a really interesting question. So if folks who want to stay for a few more minutes, I think it would be great to talk about this. So Bob Homer would like to get your thoughts on how to understand narrowing Black-white disparities in some of the outcomes in recent decades, such as life expectancy. And even some examples of higher white than Black health problems, such as drug use, drug deaths. He notes that he kind of struggles with understanding these patterns, especially given this wonderful theoretical framework that you've outlined. And so he wondered if you have some thoughts about the patterns and the trends that on surface at least don't seem to align with the theory.
Yes, that's a great question. So Hetty and I we actually wrote a commentary response in the American Journal of Bioethics in response to this question on the deaths of despair and these other patterns. And then we presented, not this current year, but last year when we were still in person at IAPHS on this very idea. And actually I draw, when I talk about this, I draw from Jonathan Metzl's work, and I draw from others' work as well. So the thing is that when we look at the Black-white patterns in health, in certain health outcomes now, we have to understand, I press myself to understand, where is this stemming from? And Metzl's book, and the name is escaping me, but I'm sure that you have all heard of it. The name is escaping me. It's only a few, it stems from his qualitative work, and it's, anyway, but what he and then other empirical work has shown is that this cultural racism of who is worthy then butts up against this idea of who seems to be getting more attention or more privilege, and where the safety net money is going, and this idea of who is getting preferential treatment. So as we talk more and more about racism and inequity over the past decades, there is a sentiment, I argue, and Metzl's book kind of outlines this really beautifully, that there is this sentiment that that Black and Brown Americans who we have decided as a society are undeserving, are now reaping the benefits of certain safety nets or things like that. There is the perception that is not reality, it is the perception. And so there then begins, so Metzl outlined in his book how then, and I think this also, What's the Matter with Kansas, which came out years and years ago, by I think a political scientist whose name is also escaping me, talked about why white Americans vote against their best interest, vote against safety net policies that will help them in the end. And I would argue that it is because we have decided who is deserving. And if there is a chance that these benefits will go to someone who we as a society has decided is not deserving, we will vote against it. And this has been shown by other researchers. So I would argue that that the health impact of poor whites actually falls right in line with cultural and structural racism, that we have decided who is unworthy, and then we need to continue watching. That's why we can't just take a slice in time to understand these racial patterns. We have to understand context and understand history, and then we can also make predictions about where this is going to go. And already we can start to see the narrative of white opioid addiction and Black opioid addiction. People have begun to publish on this, and I have a paper with Gil G. that is, the revision is under review right now again, that talks about this, that talks about very different ways. Now we are talking with white Americans about mental health, and we need to move toward mental health. Whereas whenever we were talking about this with Black Americans, it was always a discussion about the criminal justice system. So did I answer the question? I kind of took a long way around it, but essentially what I'm saying is that it does fall in line with exactly what we're seeing, and that's why we need to study history. We can't just take a slice at a moment now. We have to understand where we're coming from and who ultimately will benefit, and then we can kind of make predictions about where this is going to be, and that Black and Brown Americans will, that the equilibrium will be returned to white privilege.
Thank you so much, Maggie. It was a wonderful presentation. I know people were very engaged. I'm going to end our seminar now since we're running a little bit behind. No, it was wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. I wish it could be in person, but maybe next year. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming to this last seminar at CPC.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you.